My name is Eszter Zalan. I'm a reporter with the Brussels-based EUobserver. I mostly cover rule of law debate and populism, and I'm delighted to welcome Cas Mudde, who's joining us today. I think it's the first stop of your European tour, post-COVID European tour. So thank you for being with us. The focus of our discussion today will be the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine on European politics, European integration, political extremism in Europe, and how the far-right parties are faring after COVID and after the war in Ukraine. I'd also like to focus on what's the impact on European mainstream politics, and how the transatlantic relationship is shaping up in light of the war in Ukraine, and also taking into account the increasing political division in the US and the political radicalism in the US. The war in Ukraine represents another crisis on the continent in a very short period of time. The European narrative, or at least the EU's narrative, that it has given boost to European politics, European integration. I will be asking Cas on what he thinks of that. It also has impacted elections already on the continent. And I think it's important to look at also what impact it has on liberal democracy. Since a few years now, especially in light of the election in 2019, the European election, there's been a threat, or a perceived threat to liberal democracy. And with this geopolitical earthquake happening, I wonder, where do we stand with defending liberal democracy? Is it still under threat? The plan for today is to have a 45-minute discussion here with Cas, and then for the last 10-15 minutes of our time, I will be turning to you for questions that you might have. So I'm sure you all know Cas and his work, but let me just introduce him in a couple of words. Cas is a distinguished research professor at the University of Georgia, an adjunct professor at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. He researches and teaches on far-right politics in Western democracies, European politics, and democratic erosion, among other topics. Cas was born in the Netherlands, where he received his MA and PhD in political science at Leiden University. Before settling down in Georgia in 2012, he held positions in various universities in Europe and in the US, including the Central European University, University of Edinburgh, and University of Antwerp. He is a columnist for The Guardian's US edition and a regular contributor to Vox Europe, and the author of several books on populism and radical right. His 2019 book, The Far Right Today, has been translated into almost 10 languages. Since June 2020, Cas hosts a bi-weekly podcast called Radical, in which he discusses the radical aspect of music, politics, and sports. Welcome again, and thanks for joining us. Let me fire off with a few questions that actually you coined at the start of your podcast, and I would be super interested to hear your answers to it. So, what was the first sports team you supported?
Well, that's easy. That was PSV Eindhoven.
And it's still an ongoing love?
Oh, you never give up on your team.
Okay. What is your favorite political song?
Yeah, that's always a killer. And it depends a little bit on the day. There's a Dutch song called Over the Muur, from when I was young by Het Klein Orkest. And it's about the Cold War. And as a Cold War baby, someone who grew up in the Cold War, and particularly given the Russia-Ukraine war, I've been kind of catapulted back to the Cold War days. Okay,
interesting. What is your favorite political book? It's your questions.
I know. I always give them ahead of time to my guests, though, because so that we prevent this. I was going to go for a book by one of my colleagues. So actually, I just read a book which I think is really useful for for people wanting to understand what's going on in the US on the right side, and it's called The Flag and the Cross, by Phil Gorski and Steve Perry, I think it is. It's about white Christian nationalism, and it really explains like January 6th and kind of where the Republican Party is today.
Awesome. I would be also interested in how did you end up here? What motivated you in the first place to study populism and the radical right?
So that's always a bit of a disappointing answer, because mostly by chance. Now, my fascination with, I would say, the far right, fascism in general, I think just dates back to the fact that I grew up in the Netherlands in the 1970s, and the Dutch were absolutely obsessed with the Second World War and with the threat of fascism. And then when I was about 15, I guess, the Centre Party, a radical right party, was elected into parliament with only one seat. Right? It was 0.67 or 8% of the vote. And I mean, it was as if the Nazis had reinvaded. Like, I mean, it was the issue. You cannot imagine that today. Like, I mean, we have about a quarter of the parliament divided into 4 different radical right parties, and everyone just moves around as if nothing is happening, right? One seat, and the country just went off. And I've always been fascinated by why we were so scared. Now, I never foresaw that I would be scared too. Because most of my career, I've pretty much been arguing that the far right is not as big a threat as everyone says. But how did I come to it? Mostly I was a very bad student. Took me about 6 years to finish 4. And I wanted to do my PhD. I wanted to do it on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I met with my professor who had pretty strong ideas about Israel and Palestine, and it was clear that our views didn't align there. And I had done something on the far right in one of my courses. I had people supporting me to do that. And I was actually just interested in political parties, more generally. And even up to today, I'm not particularly fascinated by the far right. I am fascinated by how the far right interacts with what we call the mainstream.
Okay. Just before we dive into the war in Ukraine, just picking up on 2 things you said. So what do you think that has led to the fact that we're moving on when there are 4 right-wing parties in parliament? And also, are you afraid now? Do you have fear now?
Yeah, I definitely have fear, but more for the US than Europe. I mean, the US is a very, very bad situation about which we'll speak later. I think in Europe, we have peaked a bit in terms of the influence of the far right. Doesn't mean that we go back to the level that we should go back to, but they are no longer dominating the agenda because of COVID in Ukraine in the way that they did before. And in Europe, I'm still more worried about the mainstream than about the radical right. I'm more worried, as I always say, in the Dutch context, I'm more worried about Rutte than I am about Wilders. Because Rutte has power and Wilders doesn't. Now, your country is an exception. Right? I mean, obviously, Hungary has a massive problem with the far right, but from a European perspective, I think that's manageable. Now, why were we upset then and not now? I mean, that's one of the key arguments of my book. It's because of the mainstreaming and the normalization of the far right over the last couple of decades. The whole political mainstream from center-left to center-right has moved to the right, particularly on issues of immigration, of identity. But as a consequence of that, we also have normalized positions. So the idea that multiculturalism has failed, for example, is now received wisdom. Like, if I'm going to argue that multiculturalism has been a success, people will call me crazy in the Netherlands. The idea that immigration is a problem, is a threat to national identity and national security, is now a normal position. That's the common sense position. You work from that. Now, if that is the common position, then most of the contemporary radical right doesn't look that remarkable. Right? you really have to be of the level of Forum for Democracy, of Thierry Baudet, like to be really shocking. But if you look at a party like Ja21 in the Netherlands, then you just see a kind of VVD plus, right? They're not the same as the VVD, but they say things that are relatively similar too. And so we are shocked by things that are far away from us. Now, the radical right hasn't moved, right, by and large, but we have moved.
Interesting. Bringing it all into perspective with to the perspective of the war in Ukraine, how does that impact far-right parties, and is the love affair with Putin over? And how does this, where does this leave these parties on the long run, and where does this leave Putin's ability to influence European politics?
That's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So, first of all, as most of our ideas about the far right, but I would say in general about politics, they're stereotypical and they are only partly right at best. This idea that the far right are Putin's puppets in general is wrong. And it's mostly wrong because the far right as such is almost not a particularly useful category. The far right today is incredibly heterogeneous. Not just that you have extreme right, neo-Nazis like Golden Dawn, and you have like radical right parliamentary parties like Ja21 or whatever. But you have parties like Fidesz, which wins more than 50% of the power and defines the mainstream. And you have parties like the Icelandic National Front, which gets less than 1% and is irrelevant, right? So the far right in almost everything is heterogeneous. On Putin, the same. This whole idea that the far right are Putin's puppets is mostly based, traditionally actually, on Jobbik and Front National, today more on Fidesz and what is now Rassemblement National. Neither of these are necessarily ideologically very committed to Putin. It's not that they see Putin's Russia as the model. They have financial and strategic interest. Fidesz very clearly financial interest, right? And Rassemblement National and Front National got loans from banks close to Kremlin, which is in part because they have a very hard time getting loans from any French bank. Does that mean, because when you're Putin's puppets, it means that if Putin says you have to do something, you do that, irrespective of whether that's good for your own career or country or not. I think it's preposterous to argue that Marine Le Pen would choose something that is good for Russia, but bad for France, just because Putin says that. The fact of the matter is that most of the far right are against the dominant order today, let's say the global liberal order. And they are looking for a counterweight to, let's say, Biden's America, not Trump's America, of course, and the EU. And Putin is that counterweight. And of course, that makes perfect sense in the French world, where there's always strong anti-Americanism. Now, what we have seen is that because the alliance was strategic, most radical right parties have shifted. Your average radical right position today is that Putin shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, that they support Ukraine, but that they oppose sanctions because it harms the own people. They are not anti-Russia. They still think that Russia should be a partner, right? But there are very few parties that are still purely pro-Putin. And those are mostly parties that were already very marginalized, like Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands. Fidesz, of course, being the key exception to that rule. So I think at the same time, if you look at the EU, both the most anti-Putin and the most pro-Putin voices are far right. Right? The most pro-Putin is Orban. The most anti-Putin are the Poles of Law and Justice. And that again shows you like that one position of the far right does this or the far right does that is too simplistic. Overall, on this issue, the far right is deeply divided. But also, as with everyone, foreign policy is a secondary issue, also for the far right.
I would argue, though, that in Hungary, I mean, Russia is maybe not a 100% model, but the way of governing with the civil society and the idea of national conservatism, there are some parts of the menu of the Putin's way of ruling that has been taken over in Hungary as well. But on that, how, like you said, like you pointed out, I mean, PiS is now in a very different camp from Fidesz, and it seems like Orban is losing allies in Europe. Nevertheless, he is able to slow down and water down sanctions packages, define some of the conversation around sanctions and Russia. How important he is really now in the European politics?
I mean, like you, I like to talk about Orban. And to be honest, I think Orban is more isolated today than he probably has ever been. He is isolated for a variety of reasons. First of all, he's lost key allies in his own region. Babiš lost in the Czech Republic. Janša probably just lost in Slovenia. Kurz disappeared in Austria. Those were key players, absolutely key players for him, both in terms of kind of leadership support and to keep him acceptable to the center-right. So that is a major part. The other thing is that Russia has led to, and was always a dividing issue between Law and Justice and Fidesz, more than any other issue, really. At this point in time, as long as the Russian invasion of Ukraine is dominant on the political scene, I do not see PiS being able to closer its ties with Fidesz. I think that would lead to a massive backlash back in Poland. Now, why is this relevant? It's highly likely that the war will remain a war for quite a while, and we're going to the next European election. Over the last couple of years, Fidesz in the background has tried to bring the ECR and IND together. So the European Conservatives and Radicals, Reformists, led by PiS predominantly, and Identity and Democracy, led primarily by Marine Le Pen. Forever, these two groups were really separate in terms of culture, in terms of working together. Ideologically, they've come very close together. If they would come together and have, like Fidesz, they would not just be the third biggest bloc in the European Parliament, they would have at least two leaders. I mean, who knows in the future, they would even have 3 people in the European Council. They would be a force. At this point in time, they're irrelevant in the European Parliament, not because of electoral support, but because of division. I do not see a group coming together as long as Ukraine dominates. And that is significant. Does that mean that Poland no longer supports Hungary with a veto if the EU wants to really punish them? No, they will, because they don't protect Fidesz, they protect themselves. Right?
Yeah, but exactly on that, I mean, does Orban need sort of a European alliance in order to block things that are not in his interest? I mean, he doesn't. For now, it seems like it doesn't really matter if he has allies in Janša or Kurz. Of course, it feels better if you have people besides you, but he can still. He's still one voice in the European Council, and he can still block things and change the course of discussion.
I mean, that is by design, right? As long as there is a veto for important decisions, that will be the case. Now, everyone says, well, that's we have an institutional problem and design problem, but I don't see it this way. The European Union was meant to be an alliance of liberal democracy. It's made for liberal democracies. Obviously, when you have a country that's not a liberal democracy in it, your system doesn't work. And so this veto problem does not have to be such a big problem if everyone supports at least some basic ideas. And I mean, maybe I'm just old, but when I grew up, the idea that we're all liberal Democrats was kind of a very basic idea, so basic that we didn't even have to make it explicit. Today, we're not there anymore. So in that sense, it's in the design. On the other hand, just think back to 2015-16. 2015-16, Orban was the key opponent of Merkel. Right? There were two camps. He stood for the alternative. There's nowhere near that. At this point in time, the only thing that Fidesz can do and that Orban can do is protect his own fiefdom. Right? But he can't reshape Europe. He can prevent some things. Right? But the moment of this alternative order, which he was desperate to create, of transforming the EU into pretty much Hungary's image, that has passed and is not close to coming back.
You mentioned the 2019 elections, that there was a fear that populist parties would, there would be a wave of populist parties winning. Do you think that threat is gone for the next election? Also, given the fact that there will be a war fatigue at some point in Europe with the increasing inflation and energy prices, could that be an opening for populist far-right parties?
So first of all, even before the Ukraine war, overall the radical right / populism, but more the radical right, is at a roughly similar level as it was in 2019. 2019, it had come down a little bit after the so-called refugee crisis already, but it was still relatively high. Now, despite COVID and despite Ukraine, you actually see very little electoral effects. And so, while certain parties have gone down, others have gone up, overall, I don't expect the 2024 European elections to be that much different in terms of the overall score for the radical right, although it could go down a little bit more because its themes are out of the news. Like if we keep talking about Ukraine and perhaps more and more about energy and climate, it might hurt them. At the same time, if gas prices and energy prices remain a major topic, they can profit, right? But that is also up to mainstream parties. Like at the moment, by and large, they don't have a clear policy. You could choose to offset like the energy costs, particularly of, I'm an old social democrat, so particularly for the socially weaker. That seems pretty straightforward to me, is not being done. If nothing is being done about energy prices, yes, there will be absolutely a backlash. Populists will profit from that, but possibly some others as well, opposition parties. And finally, I speak more about the far right than about populism because in the European context, left-wing populism is almost irrelevant. Right? In 2008, 2009, you had this breakthrough of Syriza and of Podemos, and some other parties seemed to go up. Podemos, by and large, is no longer populist. It's still radical left, but it's not populist. Syriza is, for all purposes, kind of a mainstream social democratic party, has taken in the spot of PASOK, still has some populism in its rhetoric, like domestically. But if we talk about populism today, we almost always talk about Trump, we talk about Le Pen, we talk about AfD, and it's better and more accurate to speak about either the far right or right-wing populism than just about populism.
Where does all of this leave the European mainstream politics? I mean, there was a lot of self-congratulation in the EU right after the start of the war of, fast and united action. But you also said that basically radical right parties don't need to come to power because the mainstream is taking on a lot of their ideas. Has this process slowed down or stopped, or how is that in the perspective of the war?
Now, there's one uncomfortable issue, which is the Ukrainian refugees. Right? And so what we see at the moment is a remarkable tolerance towards refugees and a remarkable state capacity, which has been denied by many politicians, including my prime minister, for decades. Right? And lo and behold, hundreds of thousands are coming into Europe, no crisis, like we're not going to hell. We can actually, most countries can take care of them. Some countries are so incompetent that they can't, like the Netherlands. But everything goes fine, like big consensus about it. Now, that has been criticized, particularly outside of Europe, as racist. And to be honest, I think there is an element to that. At the same time, it's not the whole story. Like the fact that Europeans are more sympathetic towards Ukrainian refugees than towards Syrian refugees also has to do with one issue which has a xenophobic element perhaps, but it's that this idea that Ukrainians will go back, and in part because it's not a civil war but a war, right? And therefore there is a clearer endpoint to it. But it's also egocentrism, right? I mean, for a Dutch person, or let alone a Polish person, the idea that you could be next is much more likely with regard to Ukraine than it is to Syria, right? At the same time, it kind of confirms the radical right idea, right? That we should only take refugees from neighboring countries, that we should take care of other Europeans, not of others. And so in that sense, you see very few radical right parties speaking out against Ukrainian refugees. So there is that element. On the other hand, I believe that the Ukrainian war is putting the European Union and European states under pressure to reform in a way that is more fundamental than previous crises have, and there's a bigger chance that it will actually happen. I mean, in the end, the Great Recession has led to virtually no structural change. The so-called refugee crisis has led to not that much change, it's just more of what was already initiated. There are two issues at the moment that are front stage that have pretty much not been addressed in public debate. One is defense policy, which is long overdue, and which was a little bit discussed after Trump pretty much said that the US would no longer protect Europe, but then kind of left because Biden came and everything was great again, right? And energy policy. Now, I think that these two are huge. You see more investment in defense, but I think that there will, however reluctant everyone is, there will have to be a debate about how Europe protects itself. It should by now be absolutely clear that the US is not interested in playing the same role that it has been playing for the last 60, 70 years. That is not just a Republican issue, that's a Democratic issue as well. At the very minimum, they want Europe to be responsible for its own defense in the region, while they are the big brother in the backside that will come out if really necessary, right? How is that to be done? This is a major challenge, particularly because of Brexit, right? EU really has only two armies, one of them just left. So to build up a European defense structure with only the French is going to be a challenge, but has to be done. Obviously, defense goes to the heart of sovereignty, and so that goes to a lot of debate about European integration. Second is energy policy. What we see at the moment is remarkable. We have no debate about it, but it is absolutely remarkable, particularly what Germany is doing in terms of its dependence on Russian fossil fuels. The cost of divesting from Russia are massive. The longer you have divested, the more expensive it becomes to reinvest in Russian fossil fuels. On top of that, it's unpopular for environmental reasons and political reasons. So given that I think the war will continue for a while, there's a fair chance that we are resetting the way we structure energy. Now, that obviously has massive consequences for everything, right? Every aspect of the economy, everything else, but also about which new alliances you have. These will have to be addressed. Will they be addressed with vision? Probably not, because we have not had a truly ideological debate about where Europe needs to go in the last decades. But there will be a debate. and it will create different alliances.
On this issue of vision, you've said before that defending liberal democracies in Europe, one of the key is to have a coherent vision or ideology. So what you're saying is you don't see anything like that emerging, or any leader who dares to lead emerging.
No, I think we always look at two, right? We always look at either Germany or France. Now, the Germans never want to, right? Germans get very uncomfortable when they're put in the position of being the leader of Europe, let alone of laying out a vision of where things have to go. And Scholz is in that sense a really German leader, very pragmatic, small steps, everything. Macron would generally fit that, is a man who loves to have the big visions, as French leaders do, but is a little bit preoccupied at the moment, going through a pretty dramatic parliamentary election. And it's kind of been criticized as well for being so busy with Ukraine rather than with first his presidential election and now the parliamentary election. So kind of slowly disappeared from this debate over the last months. There are no others, right? There are people who are influential, like my prime minister, for example, but my prime minister is also famous for saying that he has no visions, and if you have a vision, you have to go to the eye doctor. Right? And so he just moves along and tries to stop whatever is costly, and moves a little bit into other directions. There are very few others. Draghi? I mean, he's gone by the next election, right? I mean, I think that the point is this doesn't necessarily have to come from political leaders, right? I mean, seriously, the issues of both defense and energy are so fundamental that pretty much anyone who's concerned with European politics should be busy with that. But my idea about vision goes beyond that. Like it is about what Europe is about, what liberal democracy is about. I mean, the reason why various countries have slipped so much in terms of liberal democratic norms and values, in my opinion, is because they don't actually know what the core liberal democratic values and institutions are. And it makes it very difficult to defend them. So when someone wants to chuck off a small point, right, but you don't really see the overall view, you think, okay, that's not such a big compromise. But Austria is a terrible example, for example, of how liberal democracy can be undermined, partly by the FPÖ, but far more by the ÖVP, right? Recently, the electoral manifestos of the Dutch parties were analyzed on the basis of their liberal democratic values, right? Yet again, the program of the VVD of Prime Minister Rutte scored the worst on liberal democracy. There were various other major parties that scored really poorly. And is that because they're hidden fascist? No, right? But are they particularly concerned and aware of what the foundations of liberal democracy are? Also no, right? And I think that we can't afford that anymore, because that was fine when there were no major radical and extremist challenges, but they are there now. And so we are in a defense mode. And to defend what you stand for, you have to understand what you stand for.
Conscious of the time, I want to move on to transatlantic relations, and also what you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation is what is happening in the US. Should Europeans be how worried? I mean, they should be, but how worried? What's happening in the US, and particularly the Republican Party?
Well, on the upscale, less worried than me, because you don't live there. But that's about it. I mean, for everything else, incredibly worried. As long as Europe is by and large banking on the US to protect them, and mostly do all of their heavy lifting in foreign policy, the fact that the US is going to be governed by a party that openly espouses anti-democratic beliefs is increasingly isolationist should be a major concern. Now, that's the story of the Republicans. I'll tell a little bit more about that. But the other thing that I think people just don't understand is that the Democratic Party is also moving away from Europe. Obama already did that. It was barely noticed in the European debate, but the US is obsessed with China. That is a completely bipartisan obsession, one of the few that they still have left. Right? Biden, because he is so old, right, is still purely transatlantic. And even he, if you read through the fine print, you will see that his commitment now in the Ukraine war is already of a different order. The next Democrat, whoever it is, will be less focused on Europe. This has in part to do with the demographic shift in the United States, and particularly of the electorate of the Democratic Party. More and more of the voters and of the leaders of the Democratic Party are Hispanic, and their cultural ties are with Latin America. Just as the former elite was purely European and therefore very much focused on Europe, the new elite is going to be increasingly Asian and Latin American, and that is going to be where they're going to be focused. So even in the best case scenario, which I don't have enough optimism to see that Biden is being reelected or another Democrat is reelected, the US is moving away and will want the EU to do much more, Europe to do much more for its own defense, as well as all kind of other things. Much more likely, though, is that the next Congress is dominated by the Republican Party, both houses. The president is going to be a Republican, Trump or DeSantis, and of course the court is already controlled by the Republicans. That is a vision that, I don't know, that's like Orban in charge of every aspect of it. And even, you might say, oh, that's kind of extreme. No, actually the Republican Party is in many ways, like for most of you, probably the image of like a really bad radical right person is Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen lost the presidential elections. Did she deny that? No. She directly accepted it. The whole party accepted it, moved on. In my country, like the main party of the opposition now selects its candidates purely on the basis of whether you accept that the election was stolen or not. If you think that it wasn't stolen, you pretty much die in the primary elections. Now, if you then know that according to a recent Economist article, more than 90% of all House seats are decided in the primaries, then you will get an impression of what type of people are being elected. There are very few European equivalents of it. Like in my state, Georgia, we have one of our representatives speaks about Jewish space lasers being used. Like, that is what we're talking about, and that is not the craziest anymore. Like, the type of people that are being elected now are even further away from that. So we really have to move away from this idea that this is a conservative party like kind of hijacked by a far-right leader. No, the Republican Party is a far-right party with extremist minority and a few conservatives, right? And they are going to be back in power. They're not going to do anything towards Europe. They're just not going to care about it. And with regard to, of course, Russia, Republicans in Congress have been pretty hawkish, but the midterms are in November, and they're going to change the composition of Congress. And this old school kind of hawkish anti-Russian Republican is becoming also a minority. And if you have a president like Trump or DeSantis, like, he's not going to back these type of budgets for Ukraine, for example, as Rand Paul already obstructed it now. So it's going to be a much more isolationist, or at the very least, much more Pacific-oriented US.
How did this takeover of the Republican Party happen, what seems to be so fast in the end? And also, could you address the media's role in that?
But it wasn't so fast. The problem is that we, in part because of the electoral system, you only see it when they get the majority. But first of all, there has been a fundamental transformation of the conservative landscape, which predates Fox. Has to do with talk radio, has to do with Christian radio, has to do with the radicalization of the evangelical movement. That goes back to the 80s. That was always race-related, as everything in the US is race-related. If I drive outside of my town for 15, 20 minutes, I only have a few radio stations. Talk radio, which is exclusively right-wing. Christian radio, which is exclusively right-wing, right? They share the same worldview, by and large. So this whole mediascape is important. The other thing that we forget about, but it's not that long ago, is the Tea Party, which was 2008, 2009. The Tea Party had a transformation at the local level and the state level of the Republican Party. Now, the Tea Party created opportunists like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, who came in with a radical agenda and then pretty much bowed to their donors. But they had raised those expectations, the expectations of fighting the Republicans in name only, the rhinos, fighting big business, et cetera, et cetera. And so the base wanted that. And what do you then get? You get Trump, right? But the thing is, Trump doesn't control this groundswell. The groundswell doesn't control the groundswell. No one is in control at the moment. Fox News tried, for example, to get Cruz elected, not Trump. Everyone forgets that, but Fox News was anti-Trump. Fox News had to change because its viewers were upset that they were critical about Trump. Trump spoke in favor of vaccines, was booed, right? So there is not this top-down thing. There is an out-of-control base that is not confronted by anything else, because most people have just jumped on that bandwagon knowing that the Trump base decides the primaries. They don't decide the main elections, they decide the primaries. But if 90% of the seats are decided in primaries, who cares about the main election?
Do you see in Europe anything like this emerging from the ground in any of the countries?
No, for a wide variety of reasons. But first of all, the media structure is completely different. The electoral system is completely different. Also, the donors and the power of them is completely different. Even something like Hungary is very different. Hungary is incredibly controlled. Again, Fidesz has a very strong organization, is a classic pyramid. They have a vision, in that sense, much more dangerous, in a sense, than the US, or more effective, I would say. And for all, and we should worry about the far right, but we also should keep in mind, when we talk, for example, about Alternative for Germany, it's 10%. It's 10%. 90% does not vote for that. I mean, that is just a completely different scale, right? In most of Europe, the radical right is a minority whose power depends on the majority, which is Liberal Democratic Party, which means that they have the power. They can decide to follow them or not. In the US, we live in two different worlds, and in a system that is designed for minority rule.
Orban, or Budapest, has recently hosted a CPAC, and do you see any alliance building between US conservatives and Hungarian conservatives, or is this something that you could read something into?
So Orban has spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, partly through the EU subsidies, to wooing mostly Anglo-Saxon conservatives. And I think there's a reason for that. I actually also think it shows the weakness of Orban and his European isolation. It is, I think, in part because of the fact that within the European People's Party, even when he was still in it, his power and his influence was waning. He is trying to build up crucial support within the Western structure outside of the EU. He already has, obviously, very good relations to Russia and China, but they can't do much to protect him within the EU structure. The US and the UK can. And so he's mostly reaching out to so-called conservatives in the Anglosphere. He feds them by giving them very generously paid fellowships. He has a new magazine where they pay, from what I understand, extremely well. The idea is that these people are going to give him an in with Boris Johnson, President Trump, if he comes back, as well as create a supportive structure for when they're back in power to protect Hungary. I think that's what it's all about. It's not about a counter world or whatever. This is about protecting Fidesz, protecting Orban. And it makes sense, particularly with the US, because it took Orban about 2.5 years to finally get his meeting with Trump. He fired the ambassador in DC over the lack of access. He was very frustrated about being pretty much so far away from Trump and pretty much not getting much support. So I think this is all about that. And to be honest, what is most amazing is just the amounts of money that are being spent on that, as well as the willingness of an ever-growing group of conservatives, including academics, to be bought by an authoritarian leader.
Just one question before we go to questions from the audience. For example, Hungary's government or conservative elite is also arguing that, well, they're just national conservatives who want to take back some of the powers that were lost during the past decades due to various issues to the markets, to global dynamics. And they're also a counter-reaction to this like liberalism in overdrive, and then they coin terms like gender ideology and so forth. What are your thoughts on that, and what could be arguments against those statements?
So most Europeans think that I've become Americanized and like gone completely woke. Unlike many Europeans, I don't think that racism is only an American problem. I don't think institutional racism is only an American problem. Institutional racism is a major problem in most countries, particularly Britain, France, the Netherlands. The whole issue about woke, a term which I don't like to use because it's a far-right term, it's based on the argument that identity is irrelevant to politics, which is amazing coming from the far right, which is where it comes from, which is all about identity, right? And so obviously the argument is not about identity is irrelevant. The argument is that certain identities are irrelevant. I believe very strongly that identity and social justice is part of whatever socioeconomic program you have. You can't have socioeconomic equality if you have an identity-based inequalities. And the other way around. You can have all the laws that you have that protect all the different groups equally, but if there are structural socioeconomic differences, as there are in many countries, on the base of identity, culture, whatever you want to call it, then that will have political consequences. What is important is that what I see over and over again in the US and in Europe is that the right, but also part of so-called liberals, let's say center-left, is falling into this trick of all the time responding to their agenda. Obviously, there have been some people cancelled, right? Leaving aside whether that is bad or not, which I don't particularly think. There's no God-given right to have a column in the New York Times, right? But let's say there are a few people that were cancelled and it's bad. And let's say that there are more people cancelled by the left than by the right, which empirically isn't true, but let's just say that. Then it is still not a major issue. Like, the number of cases is minimal, and set that against the consequences of institutional racism. I only say in the Dutch consequence, like the belastingfraude crisis. There is no comparison. So, yes, you can talk about these issues. Yes, you can worry about it going rogue, but it does not equal to the problem of institutional racism. Now, to national conservatism. So national conservatism is a movement which comes out of an Israeli who started it, mostly American-funded and Anglo. It wants to bring together what is traditionally considered conservatives, like the Republican Party, Conservative Party, and the radical right. And real radical right, like Meloni in Italy, Marion Maréchal in France, recently at CPAC was Tom van Grieken of Vlaams Belang. So again, this argument that this is just conservatism, no, this is a new and important alliance between what used to be the mainstream right and the radical right. I was very worried about it, in part because of Marion Maréchal, whom I kind of saw as the real threat to French democracy. But Marion Maréchal turned out to be not as genius as I thought she was by choosing Zemmour over her aunt, which was just an amazing misstep. So far, outside of Britain, perhaps, national conservatism hasn't done that much. And so outside of CPAC, these parties do not work together. And I'm not sure whether the real alliances are being made there. I think in the end, what is still much more worrying is that parties like the Conservative Party, Les Républicains, the Republican Party have moved so far to the far right and are willing to work with people who are absolutely clearly far right.
Okay, let's go to questions from the audience. If there are any, and please introduce yourselves as you ask a question. There's one.
Hi, Jesse Pinser, Follow the Money. I'm a journalist. I was wondering what you make of the decision of the Commission to approve the RRF for Poland, and which most likely the member states will do as well later this week. What does it say about how we in Brussels treat rule of law issues in Poland?
Yeah, I think it confirms that liberal democracy is secondary and remains secondary. And this is why, this is the bizarre hypocrisy about the fight against Putin, which on the one hand is celebrated as the importance of Europe, because isn't Ukraine punished for wanting to be like Europe, and celebrating liberal democracy against illiberal authoritarianism. And then on the other hand, turns out that the real litmus test is actually not whether you're liberal democratic or not, but it's whether you're anti-Putin or not. And so at the moment, Poland is making the most out of its anti-Putin position, which has nothing to do with liberal democracy. They're not against Russia because it's an illiberal democracy. This has completely different issues. And they're milking it, and good for them, right? Because they know the hypocrisy of the EU, and they're exploiting it. But it is an affront to the millions of Poles who have been fighting the illiberal democratic government, right? And it is a lesson that is learned by everyone in the region, by everyone. The lesson they already learned from Fidesz is that you can be liberal, that liberal democracy is not as important as voting with the majority at the right time, right? And so if you have leverage, you can compensate for this. Obviously, Hungary doesn't win because they're on the wrong side of this particular conflict. Right? But others will know what the real priority of Europe is at this moment. I think it's a terrible, terrible signal to set. And of course, I understand what it said. There will be a moment in which we evaluate it 1.5 years from that. But we all know how that works, right? And even if they would actually then sanction, it's still 1.5 years of getting your money. On top of that, it still shows the same thing. We can negotiate about it. They say that liberal democracy is really problematic, really important, but under certain conditions, we can talk. And so I think it's dramatic, and I also think that it will nevertheless be passed despite some of the opposition that is being voiced at the moment.
Thanks.
Hello, Pia Gripenberg, Swedish journalist. I have 2 questions, if I may. You talk about the European leaders stepping forward, and clearly Ursula von der Leyen has tried to do that, to take the lead in Europe. And how has she succeeded, and what do you think she will act going forward? And also, then you mentioned that Draghi will be gone in some years. In Italy, it's quite a large right-wing movement, and how will that affect if some of them might be prime minister in the future?
Yes, if I understood, the first question had to do with von der Leyen and her leadership. And I think that's a consequence of the lack of leadership at other levels, right? Von der Leyen was elected with the support of Orban. And I think that so far Orban has pretty much gotten his money worth, as is many others. Von der Leyen is, to me, Merkel. Pragmatic to the level that whenever there is an issue with liberal democracy, she's willing to move on. Merkel famously, pretty much protected Orban against everything, as well as the relationships with Russia. And so von der Leyen is a pragmatist at the moment, leads to create an anti-Putin coalition, and as said, that leads to giving money to Poland because Poland is on the right side. It's not her fault. I mean, this is just peak EU. Right? I would hope that one day we get beyond that and there's someone who actually stands for something. With regard to Italy is still shifting, but the radical right majority in terms of seats has been pretty stable over the last 2 years. I don't necessarily see that change, but of course what did change was the power relationships within the bloc. Salvini was dominant for a long time, now has structurally fallen behind Meloni of the Brothers of Italy, which means that by the logic of politics, there will be a bloc of 3 to 4 parties led by Meloni. That means that Salvini will have to be second fiddle to a woman. I don't really see that go very well. For Salvini, who already was near power, it's crunch time. It's kind of now or never. Being second fiddle to a far-right woman is very hard to come back from. I mean, either that coalition wins and Meloni will again be in power, or they lose and Salvini also won't be in power, right? So we're now expecting Salvini to put the importance of the country above the importance of himself. Bit skeptical on that. So I do expect the coalition to be there. It will be relatively weak probably because 5 Star is obviously not going to join them. But it will also, while sounding like a far-right coalition, right, it's more divided than that. Because Brothers of Italy and Lega are also very different parties in terms of mentality. And Brothers of Italy is to a certain extent the successor to Alleanza Nazionale, to the Italian social movement, the old school fascist, kind of more bureaucratic type party. Lega is a party which has now become really just the vehicle of Salvini. Very different cultures, not even talking about the North versus the rest, that is almost a secondary issue today. But in terms of cultures, in terms of leadership style, where Meloni is much more even keel, focused more on governing, working with the mainstream right. Salvini is this kind of showman politics, like working through social media. I think that's going to be a very unstable coalition. It will, of course, be yet another far-right leader. And Meloni is part of the ECR, very well connected in it, president at the moment of it. So an alliance with Law and Justice. Now then you have like Hungary, Poland, Italy. That's a serious block in terms of members and power, right? Even it's only 3 countries, 2 of them are among the biggest countries in Europe. So I think it has relevance, but I do think that because Salvini won't be the prime minister, the internal cohesion is more problematic.
Please save the questions for after our discussion here. Thank you so much again for being here and this insightful and thought-provoking discussion. And that concludes our event, and have a safe and fruitful journey throughout Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you.